All right, let's talk about a word that gets thrown around a lot, sometimes like a compliment, other times like you've just insulted someone's grandmother: communism. It's one of those big ideas that sounds simple at first but gets complicated really, really fast. The basic concept, born from the minds of thinkers like Karl Marx way back in the 19th century, was a reaction to a world where a few people owned all the factories and got super rich, while the masses worked long hours for very little pay. He saw this and thought, hold on, this system seems a bit lopsided. What if everyone owned everything together? It was a radical idea for its time, and it still is. The core principle of communism, at least in theory, is about creating a classless society. Imagine a world with no billionaires and no one living in poverty. All the big stuff, the factories, the farms, the banks, would be owned by the community as a whole, not by private individuals. The goal is that everyone contributes what they can and gets what they need. It's like a group project where everyone actually does their part and gets the same grade. In this ideal world, the government, which Marx saw as a tool for the rich to control the poor, would eventually just fade away. It's a powerful vision of ultimate equality and cooperation. Of course, that's the theory. This vision of a perfect cooperative world is what has attracted so many people to the idea over the generations. It speaks to a deep human desire for fairness and justice. People looked at the massive inequality around them, the struggles of everyday life, and saw communism as a possible escape route, a blueprint for a better, more equitable world. It promised an end to exploitation and the beginning of a society where human needs came before corporate profits. That promise has been a powerful motivator for movements and revolutions across the globe for more than a century. But how does this differ from what many of us know as democracy? Well, in most democracies, the focus is on individual rights and freedoms, including the right to own private property and start a business. The economy is generally capitalist, meaning individuals and companies compete in a free market. Communism, on the other hand, prioritizes the collective over the individual. It proposes that true freedom can only be achieved when economic inequality is eliminated, which requires the abolition of private ownership of the means of production. So, while a democracy might protect your right to open a coffee shop, a communist system would say that the coffee shop belongs to everyone. So, we have this big idea of a perfect shared society. But what happens when you try to actually build it on the ground? This is where things get messy, and the real-world examples start to look very different from the textbook definition. Take a country like North Korea. It is officially a communist state, but it operates as a totalitarian dictatorship under one family's rule. The state controls every single aspect of life, from what you do for a living to what you are allowed to think. This is often pointed to as an example of communism taken to its most extreme and oppressive level, a far cry from the utopian vision of a withered-away state. Then you have a place like China. It is ruled by the Communist Party and maintains strict political control, but its economy is a completely different story. Since the late 20th century, China has embraced a form of market capitalism, leading to massive economic growth, glittering skyscrapers, and a new class of billionaires. So, is it communist? Is it capitalist? It's a hybrid system that some have called market socialism or state capitalism. It shows how the original communist idea has been adapted and fundamentally changed to fit modern realities, blending a single-party political system with a fiercely competitive economic engine. It's a complicated mix that defies easy labels. On the other side of the spectrum, let's look at India, the world's largest democracy. India was never a communist country in the way China or the Soviet Union were, but communist ideas had a very strong influence there for a long time, especially in certain states like West Bengal and Kerala. For decades, communist parties were major players in the political landscape, winning elections and governing millions of people within India's democratic framework. They focused on land reform, workers' rights, and public education. It's a fascinating case of communist ideology operating and competing within a multi-party democracy. But over time, the political winds in India have shifted. While communist parties still exist and hold some influence, their power has significantly declined on the national stage. the country has more fully embraced market-based economic policies, and a different kind of politics, often based on nationalism and religion, has come to dominate. The story of India shows how communism can exist as one political choice among many, and how its popularity can rise and fall depending on the changing hopes and anxieties of the people. It demonstrates that the path away from communist influence doesn't always come from a dramatic collapse, but can happen through the ballot box. So, why is communism one of the most divisive ideas in history? The main reason people disagree so strongly is that the real-world results have been so dramatically mixed and often tragic. Critics will point straight to the historical record of 20th-century communist states. They talk about the Soviet Union under Stalin, Mao's China, and Pol Pot's Cambodia, where attempts to build a communist society led to famine, labor camps, and the deaths of tens of millions of people. For these critics, the idea is inseparable from authoritarianism, the suppression of individual liberty, and economic collapse. They argue that concentrating that much power in the hands of the state will always, inevitably, lead to disaster. These opponents of communism believe that the fundamental principles are flawed from the start. They argue that human nature is inherently competitive, not cooperative, and that taking away the incentive of private property and personal gain will only lead to laziness and a lack of innovation. Why work hard if you get the same as the person who does nothing? Furthermore, they champion the successes of capitalist democracies, pointing to the immense wealth, technological progress, and personal freedoms they have generated. For them, the debate is over. History has shown that capitalism, for all its flaws, is simply the better system for human prosperity and freedom. But the debate doesn't end there, because many people still believe in the core ideals of communism. They argue that the failures of the 20th century were not failures of the idea itself, but brutal distortions of it. They claim that countries like the Soviet Union were not truly communist, but were actually state capitalist dictatorships that betrayed the original principles of worker control and democracy. These supporters separate the theory of Marx from the practice of Stalin. They believe that a more democratic, humane version of communism is still possible and is, in fact, more necessary than ever in a world with runaway climate change and massive wealth inequality. For these modern proponents, the problems that Marx wrote about over 150 years ago haven't gone away. If anything, they've gotten worse. They see a global system where a handful of corporations have more power than most governments, and where the gap between the ultra-rich and everyone else is wider than ever. They look at issues like the climate crisis and argue that a system based on infinite growth and profit is driving us toward disaster. For them, communism, or at least a form of socialism inspired by it, isn't a stupid or failed idea, but a vital alternative that we need to explore to create a more just and sustainable future. The history of communism is not a single, straight line. It's a tangled web that has been respun and reinterpreted in every country it has touched. In Russia, it was built through a violent revolution, became a global superpower, and then collapsed spectacularly. In China, it started with a peasant revolution and has morphed into a global economic powerhouse that blends authoritarian control with a hyper-competitive market. In Cuba, it became a symbol of resistance to American influence, surviving for decades despite a crippling economic embargo. Each country has its own unique story, showing that communism is not a one-size-fits-all ideology. This complicated history is why the facts can sometimes feel mixed up or hijacked. Was the Soviet Union's industrial might a communist success, or was its environmental devastation a communist failure? Is China's economic boom a betrayal of communism, or a clever adaptation of it? The answers often depend on who you ask and what part of the story they choose to focus on. History is written by the victors, as they say, and in the ideological battle between capitalism and communism, the narrative has been fiercely contested from all sides, making it hard to find a simple, unbiased truth about what really happened. So, after all this, what is real communism? That might be the hardest question of all. For some, real communism is the theoretical endpoint described by Marx, a stateless, classless, moneyless society where everyone lives in harmony. By that definition, It has never actually existed anywhere on Earth. For others, real communism is what we've seen in practice: the one-party states, the centrally planned economies, and the political repression. And for a new generation of thinkers, it's something else entirely. Perhaps a form of degrowth communism focused on ecological sustainability, rather than industrial production. The reason people still debate it so fiercely today is because the questions it raises are still incredibly relevant. How should we organize our society? What do we do about extreme inequality? How can we live sustainably on a finite planet? Communism offers one set of radical answers to these questions. You might think it's a terrible idea, a dangerous fantasy that has only ever led to suffering, or you might think it's a beautiful ideal that has just never been properly tried. But one thing is for sure: as long as people dream of a fairer world, the ghost of communism will continue to be a part of the conversation. Follow for more.